Yeah, yeah. Making her way to the mic. They start dimming the lights. You start feeling alright. From Birmingham, home of the Teddy Longs, and the rumor stutters. More once you discover. For all of the lovers, Whitney Houston and Roman Reigns. For all of the lovers, and Mickey James and Marvin Gaye. For all of the lovers, and Sasha Banks, Janelle Monáe, Silk, Sonic, and Paige. Allow me to say, look, I just found a place, sweet escape for every one of us. I was kinda late, cause I just made it off the struggle bus. Walking by the fate, cause I know it's right in front of us. Yo, I ain't with the hate, gotta focus on what's great. Ladies and gentlemen, Steph Hardy is on the air. Had to drop a couple bars just to make you all aware. So, sit back, relax, enjoy the show. You know I go by Joe or the rest of the flow, yeah.
Hey y'all, welcome to the Hardy Wrestling Podcast on this new episode on this Friday afternoon. Thank you guys so much for watching wherever you're looking at. Thank you so much for looking at this show and for giving it time and just for allowing it into your wrestling heart and mind and space. Of course, I'm your girl, Stephanie Hardy, host and creator of this fabulous platform and writer for Women's Wrestling Talk and color commentator featured on the Belladonna Division, Battle Club Pro, Black Girl Magic 2022, and soon to be Spartan Wrestling next weekend, y'all. And I have an amazing special guest. I consider him Black media royalty, and he is just an amazing voice in the wrestling space, in the sports space as a whole. He is Andreas Hale. He is the senior writer for the Sporting News. You've seen him on his own show with Kel Dansby, the Corner Podcast, with so many amazing guests. He's written for so many amazing places like BET, Billboard, Jay-Z's Life and Times, everything. So I am so honored to have him here. How are you, Andreas?
I'm good. You call me royalty. That's crazy. I appreciate that, but man, it's tough to hear those kind of accolades. But thank you so much, and I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I can understand how it is tough to hear him because I still have a hard time taking in compliments myself. But like the compliments I give come from a real place. And it's just like every time, whenever I see you doing things, it's always, for the support of the Black community. And then also, for the love of wrestling and combat sports as a whole and just sports, period. You just do like so many amazing things. And it's just, you deserve the flowers and you deserve to be appreciated for that. So yeah, that's just how I see you. I see you as, Black media royalty, and that's just where it comes from. It's real.
That's crazy. It's crazy because I'm sure we're going to talk about like me a lot, but to be in this space is something that I've always wanted to do. But to be able to leave an impression on certain people and for it to be called Black media royalty is like, that's crazy. Like you live your whole life just trying to make a difference and make sure you're heard by somebody. And I live in Las Vegas. I work in my office. I leave the house when I have to go to work and things of that nature. But you never know who's paying attention. So the fact that you're able to say that and I'm touching you so many miles away, thank you. Genuinely, thank you.
Absolutely, you definitely deserve it because your work speaks for itself. Like it's like it's kind of like how you think of a who's who, but in your case, it's almost like a where has he been and where hasn't he been. So that's really what it is. So I got to start off by asking you the question I ask all of my guests, and that's when did you fall in love with wrestling?
Oh my God. Okay, so I was born and raised in New York. Well, not completely raised. I moved to Vegas when I was like 9, but born in New York. And my grandmother was a full-blooded Italian woman. She was
Mm-hmm.
also kind of sort of racist, but that's a conversation we'll get to shortly. Um, she used to take me to wrestling shows at like the Garden in New York. So when I was a kid, I'm dating myself, but I got to see before I could really remember, like Ken Patera and Ivan Putski and Bob Backlund and the Iron Sheik. And from that point on, I just fell in love with it. My life started with pro wrestling. My earliest memories are of pro wrestling, right? Even before like my parents, I just think about wrestling. And I've never gotten out of it. I've been a pro wrestling fan since I guess my first memories are at 3. And I'm 44 now, so it's like that's all my life has been pro wrestling in some way, shape, or form. Whether I've been working in music or entertainment or sports, pro wrestling's always been there for me.
See, first of all, I would not have guessed 44 at all. So you look great, number one.
Thank you.
And number two, yeah, it seems like you started really with a lot of OGs or people who would be considered OGs now. Definitely rest in peace to Iron Sheik and just so many different people, in the garden that you mentioned who was a who's who of back then. And you don't really know your life without it. And that's kind of like me. Like I started when I was 4 and it was for me and my dad. And then it was my grandma before him too. So it was just like, it's been a family affair and I don't know my life without it either. So I definitely understand that. So you mentioned that you moved from New York to Las Vegas. Like, what was that transition like if you were able to really grasp that change at all?
I mean, moving from New York to Vegas, so my grandmother raised me, took care of me, and she decided to be closer to my father, who was in Vegas at the time. So I was in private school. I went to Catholic school in New York, and ended up in Vegas going to public school. And we just packed up and we drove across the country from New York
Whoa.
to Vegas for, I believe it was like between Christmas and New Year's. So it was like we spent like a week and a half driving. And when I got out here, Vegas was dumb small. We didn't have any sports teams. It was like 8 high schools, if that. School, like everything was small, and it was a culture shock. Growing up in New York, you see like the melting pot of people. In Vegas. It was black people, but you didn't see a lot of them, right? Because you didn't know where the hell they were. The Strip and Circus and all these places, and it was hot. It was just different. Funny thing is, when I first got to Vegas, the first thing my grandmother did was take me to the Showboat where AWA Wrestling was, and I got to see the Midnight Rockers before Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty became the Rockers in WWE. So I used to see them,
Wow.
Larry Zbyszko, like I used to be at those shows ringside like every week. So it made the transition easier for me because it felt I was still kind of at home because I could still go see my wrestling every week.
That's insane that you guys drove that far because I mean, it's funny to think flying from where I am in Alabama to LA is a big deal, but then I can only imagine what it's like to even drive across the country like that. And it's so funny you mentioned how Las Vegas is small in comparison to New York. And it's just like in my mind, I only ever think of Las Vegas and New York as big, even though I've been to New York before. Like
Mhm.
last year, I went like 3 times. And it was amazing and everything. And I have family there and it's great. But at the same time, I've only ever thought of Las Vegas as huge. So it's pretty interesting for you to say that it's small.
It is. I mean, it's really small. Like again, it's gotten a lot bigger since I've been here. Now we have the Raiders, the Aces. We're about to have a baseball team. We have the Golden Knights. It's become a city. But back then, it was like, do you live in casinos? People would ask me all the time. Like the Strip was the only thing that anybody knew, and so it was very different. And again, it's a culture shock. Like growing up in New York, where like my uncle loved like hip hop and used to get me like mixtapes and all that stuff all the time. So I had to have them sent to me from New York because there was nowhere to get them out here in Vegas. So it's just a very different experience growing up and living in Vegas. I mean, there was I used to go to didn't go to them, but when Mike Tyson used to fight, me and my friends would like drive down or ride down to the MGM and hang out in the lobby just to see who was going to be there because it was like Hollywood on a certain street. Then you just go back to your regular life, which was like boring in junior high and high school. It's a unique experience, like living in a 24-hour city that's known for like gambling, like prostitution. Very strange place.
Yeah, I imagine so. Like that has to be insane. But it seemed like, you really did make an amazing experience out of it, having your regular life experience, but then mixing in a lot of the glamour, that you were able to see with that as well. And then of course, wrestling had its place there too. So you and your grandmother had that in common, and that was able to sort of help you transition and feel more so at home. But I can't help but, ask you, like, your grandma was racist, Andreas? How did that work?
So my grandma's full-blooded Italian woman from Sicily.
Hmm.
She dated and married a black man and had my father. But she was never particularly fond of African Americans. I just the way it was. Being Italian and her bloodline, they weren't fond of them. It's just how it was. So me growing up, I was always taught that I was unlike the rest of them. And as I got older, I was like, no, I am them. Right.
Mm.
So it was, I love my grandmother with all my heart, God rest her soul, but it was an experience being raised by a white woman who didn't want you to really be like the other black people out there. I'll never forget the Rodney King riots happened. And she was like, they're out there doing this. And I'm a kid. And I'm like, those are the people that look like me. I should be out there with them instead of being at home scared of them. So it was it was one hell of an experience. And one of the things that in pro wrestling that helped me uh with my blackness and the experience and like drive me to doing what I want to do is like when the Nation of Domination was wrestling. My grandmother booed him. I cheered
Mhm.
for him. And we would have debates. She was like, "Oh, that Malcolm X, he's full of shit." And I was like, "Wait, what? Like, what are we
Oh.
talking about here?" But me, if anybody knows me, I'm super pro black. I've always grown up that way. I've always wanted to know my roots. I've read a lot. Like, it's been my experience. And I've always felt like it made me realize like wrestling was a reflection on society through a certain viewpoint, which at the time was Vince McMahon, which was also a semi-racist, stereotypical view of what minorities were. And it made me look at wrestling a lot different. And I've always carried that for the rest of my life. And as I've gotten to this point in my career, that's why I'm always propping up black wrestlers and minority wrestlers, because I know how difficult it could be when somebody doesn't see you as one of the boys or one of the girls. They see you as, oh, you should, the Mexicans, hey, ride a lawnmower. Or if you're black, hey, you should shuck and jive and dance. So it was a very weird thing, but it started with my grandmother knowing what she thought of African Americans and what I was. It was like a huge clash in our house all the time.
Yeah, that sounds like a whole lot to deal with, because of course, you want to feel loved by your family, but it's really awkward, when you are what you are and you can't help that. And then you have someone else who's close to you, who you share the same blood with, saying things like that. And it's just like, ma'am, why? You see me here, right? Like
Mhm.
I imagine that had to be difficult, but, I hope that y'all were able to still, of course, have that love even through that, right?
We did. I mean, we did. It was just we had a lot of conflicts in our house.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Morehouse. When I was a kid, I was in the Kappa Leadership League, which was like a young black fraternity. I was in the Martin Luther King Youth Council. I sat on the board. I was in the We Rise Youth Council. These are all things that ran opposite of what my grandmother thought I should be doing. Like we bumped heads in my house, even with my father. Like, why do you want to go to an all black school? I was like, because I want to be around people that look like me. I want to
Right.
know what it's like to be loved because like we share the same backgrounds, and realizing that like even at Morehouse, like we share a skin color, but all skin folk and kinfolk, you find out everybody's different. But I needed to have that experience in my life. I needed to have that. But there was always love. My grandmother, till the day she had her last breath, like she loved me to death. But there were just certain things that were hard to get past. Growing up as a young black man in Las Vegas who wore his blackness on his sleeve and having a grandmother who was not really fond of that was an interesting time.
Yeah. But, I believe the most important part that you did mention was finding your identity and knowing, who you are. And that seems to be something that you knew from jump, even though, of course, you had your conflicts. You knew who you were and you were not afraid to be that. And we're going to get further into that, as we go into our conversation, because that's one of the qualities that I love about you and your work. You are who you are and there's no change in that. So when exactly did you fall in love with other forms of combat sports outside of wrestling?
Dude, wrestling's like the gateway drug for everything, right? So it's
It
like as
is.
a kid watching pro wrestling, and then like my grandmother used to watch Ray Boom Boom Mancini. So every time this guy Boom Boom Mancini fought, it was like be a party. Like all the family members would come over and watch it. And for me, I love the pageantry of boxing. And that was how I found Muhammad Ali as a kid. And we used to all watch old VHS tapes. And the way he talked, I was like, yo, he's cutting a promo. Like that's not your usual trash talk. Lo and behold, Muhammad Ali was a family of Gorgeous George, and that's how he became the Louisville Lip as Cassius Clay and became Muhammad Ali. So everything has always been pro wrestling, but MMA is the same way. I was like, oh, these guys can slam each other. The first time I saw MMA fight and somebody did a power bomb, I was like, that's a power bomb. I know what that is. you know, they all kind of work in sync together. And I think even the biggest fights in boxing and MMA have a hint of pro wrestling in them. The trash talk, because that's how you get people interested in what they're about to do. Fighting is just part of the equation, but in pro wrestling, as we know, the best talkers, the best promos, from Randy Savage to Roddy Piper to whoever, it's always been about how they talk and how they present themselves. How do you get me interested in what you're doing? And I found that in boxing and MMA as well. Like the biggest fights have this huge element of pro wrestling involved, and nobody can deny it. Even though people will try to say, "What? Why do you still watch pro wrestling? Don't you know that's fake?" And I always got to correct them. It's just not fake. Relax. But everything you do has a hint of pro wrestling in it. Even this election with Donald Trump, that was pro wrestling. It was goofy,
Oh
but it
Jesus.
was pro wrestling. That was
Yes.
100% pro wrestling. It was 100% a gimmick and a promo from Donald Trump. Like everything's pro wrestling at the end of the day.
You are absolutely right. Because it's just like, even when you go to the movies, and depending on what type of movie it is, whether it's like an action movie, superhero movie, or whatever, like me and my significant other, my boyfriend, will be watching a movie, and then he'll pick out like certain wrestling moves, like in the
Yep.
stunt work. And it's just hilarious how it does trickle through everything, and I say all the time that wrestling deserves more credit, than it gets for kicking a lot of stuff off, especially even with Hollywood, with stunt work, with having its movie stars that are on top right now, like Batista, like The Rock. Like, you don't get a successful acting career out of those two men without the ups and downs of character work that they had to do in WWE. Like, they deserve more credit when it comes to that. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that with other combat sports. Like, every time we see stuff with the UFC or anything goes viral, it's usually because these fighters have said something to each other, or they've had an interaction with each other that really does remind you of an encounter that you've seen on wrestling, like every other day, or every day in this case. So that is absolutely true. And I'm glad that, you had that with other combat sports as well. Muhammad Ali is definitely a big deal when it comes to that. Like, to this day, he's such an inspiration. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Even on your Instagram, you posted your video of how you bought the action figure that WWE
Oh
put out of
yeah.
him, and you seemed so excited about that.
I've never done like an unboxing video. I was like, these are so corny. I'm never gonna do one. But when that figure, it's over here behind me, when that came, I was like, yo, I gotta unbox this in front of everybody. Because again, it was my worlds all coming together, which is Muhammad Ali, which was boxing and the pro wrestling element. And Muhammad Ali was black as hell. Like, he was always about the
Yes.
people. I loved him to death. A man who was willing to sacrifice everything. So like, I didn't get it. I usually go to Comic-Con. I didn't get the chance to go this year. But then when Mattel put up the pre-order, I was like, yo, I'm buying that. I don't care how much it is. And then it came, and I'm a geek. And then, like, if you see behind me, I have all kinds of toys and stuff. Like, my pops used to tell me, like, one day you're going to grow out of all these things: video games, wrestling, toys. I was like, all right, now you'll come over to my house and be like, you never grew out of it. I was like, and I'm making money off of it. So chill.
That part. Okay. Definitely. That's just like how my mom told me, I'm gonna grow out of Barbies one day. And she sort of had an age limit where it was just like they would stop buying me Barbie dolls, and she would tell my dad to stop buying me Barbie dolls too. She was like, look, at this age you need to be interested in something else, and something like this and something like that. Then you fast forward to now, there's a whole movie about Barbie, and it's just making me want to get into buying dolls again. So you
Mhm.
never really grow out of the things. You sort of suppress them a bit because, everybody has to adult. But at the end of the day, the stuff you love is the stuff you love. You never really let it go.
Yeah, and
So,
that's been like my mantra my whole life. It's like, the things I love, why can't I do them as I'm older? Why can't I do them as an adult? Even my daughter, she's 6, she's about to turn 7. She's like, Daddy, why do you love pro wrestling? Are you talking to a pro wrestler today? Like, she tries to get involved and
oh,
she tries to figure it out. My son, it's like that's what he's exposed to. Whenever Daddy's downstairs doing his work, he sees me watching pro wrestling or boxing or something like that. I do what I love. And most people don't get to do what they love, right? Most people don't get
mhm.
to be involved in what they love. You can do what you love. To be involved and have a hand in changing how it's shaped and molded, it's special to me. And I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. And I'm just fortunate I've been able to do that. That's why it's also always been my goal to prop up other people to try to get into space. Because as Black folks, we got a hard time getting in these spaces. So if I can open the door for a few people to come through, that's what I want to do.
That's amazing. I'm glad that you have that mindset. And I love that your children get to see that too. Like, your kids are adorable. You have a great family. Like,
Thank
they
you.
they look so amazing. So, when did you know that you had a gift for storytelling and you wanted to sort of pursue that as your life's passion?
Oh my God, that's a good question. So I didn't graduate from Morehouse. It's a long story. Uh,
It's okay.
but I didn't go to college for like journalism. I went to college for business management because I didn't know what the hell I wanted to do. I just knew I wanted to get out of Vegas and I wanted to go to Morehouse because Trey Styles and Boys in the Hood and Outkast were from Atlanta. And I was like, I got to go to Morehouse. And because the freak nigga was out there, I was like, I got to go to Morehouse. I started with business management and I was like, I don't even know what I'm doing here. Right. Like I was trying to figure it out. But I loved hip hop and I love talking about hip hop. I've been involved in the space for a long time. But prior to all this, I used to do my English papers and my teachers used to give me a hard time because of how I wrote. And there was like, it's not bad or anything like that. It's just like you write in this very specific voice. And, it's not like our other students. So I can't give you an A for this assignment because it's not in my vision. And I always felt like English teachers were like failed writers, which is
Oh,
probably not true,
wow.
but that's always felt. So it upset me. So when I came back from Morehouse, I used to frequent a store called Hip Hop Site, and I used to come in and I used to see like the CDs of artists that I really liked, like Little Brother or MF Doom or Eminem. And I used to read like the Source magazine. And I used to see like these very skewed views of like what music was and what hip hop was and the stories that they told. And I was like, I could do that better. And it wasn't from a place of arrogance. It just felt like artists have stories to tell. People have stories to tell. And I've always been interested in people in their stories. The why, like why do you do what you do? Not what you're doing, but why do you do it? So I wrote a review for like Little Brother's first album on a whim for Hip Hop Site. They asked if anybody knew how to write. I was a customer. And I was like, I could do it. They were like, who are you? And I was like, I could do it. Just give me a chance. And I wrote the review and they were like, oh, you want a job? And I was like, okay, sure. And that's kind of how I dove in. But I've always like wanted to present a different angle of storytelling that I felt like wasn't being given. And I just kind of had a knack for it. It was nothing I went to school for. It was nothing that was taught to me. It was just what I wanted to do.
That is so cool. And it's so funny. Like, there's no shame in not, finishing school. I mean, it's okay. People do that sometimes. It's fine, but it's just the idea that it was sort of like something that you knew that you could do. Just that's really inspiring because you were just like, look, I'm writing and this is how I write and this is my voice. But then the teachers were like, no, like you have to write this way. But no, like you knew what your voice was. And because you had the confidence in yourself, relatively early, you were just like, look, I know I can do this, give me the ball, I can shoot it. And that's what you did. And that's really cool that you combined, something that you did enjoy along with another thing that you enjoyed, which was hip hop, and you wrote about it. And then that's how, you got started in that. So that's real.
Thank you. Yeah, it's everybody has a different path, right? Like, some people they're like, I got all these journalism degrees and they can't write. Like I've been editor for a lot of people and I've read their raw copy and I was like, you can't write. There's other
Oh,
people who
Jesus.
don't have an ounce of like of journalism, but they know how to write. They have a fantastic voice. And it's like I've always liked the idea of like cultivating writing styles and things of that nature. But I kind of figured out what I wanted to do because I really didn't have a clue like what I was going to do with my life. I was trying to figure it out, but I just knew what I loved. And I was like, and if I can tell stories about the things I love and people want to read them, cool. And then it just kind of worked out.
Yeah. So how did the people in your life, in like your family or like your friends respond to you when you knew that this was a thing that you wanted to do?
Well, my friend, like, I wanted to be a rapper once upon a time, right? Like, I really wanted to be a rapper, and not because I wanted to show off anything. It's because I wanted to tell stories, right? I always felt like growing up, like my favorite rappers were like Nas, because I loved how he was able to illustrate the things in New York through words, right? So I wanted to be like that, but it just that never worked out. Um, but I wanted to write about it, and I didn't really tell my family. I kind of hid it from them because like writing
Mm.
was like a nerdy thing to do. Like sitting at a computer and typing all the time. Like everybody wants to play sports or do something like that. And I just wanted to write. Um, so it was never met with, oh, cool. It was just like, you sure that's what you want to do? Why don't you like go get a real job? And I was like, I think I can make this a real job. And my wife, who's been there since the beginning, was always supportive of me. But even she at the time was just like, you're just gonna write about music all the time. And I was like, yeah, I didn't live in New York. I wasn't going to go fly to New York to get a job. I was like, I think I could do it. You know, there's this thing called the internet. So I think, you know, people can read my stuff on the internet. She was really supportive, but at first it's like you tell people you want to write for a living and they're like, they don't really get it. And my family didn't really get it. My father worked in a casino most of his life. My grandmother did like telemarketing. They they weren't sure how I was going to make a living or how I was going to make money out of it. So they just kind of shrugged their shoulders to it. It was like, okay, cool. Tell me when you get a real job.
Mm. Yeah, that's usually how it is when people want to pursue a job that isn't like STEM based, or if it's not like concrete, like something that you can just, interview for and then just get, like working at a bank or like working at a restaurant or something like that. It's like if we say you want to do something that's very artistic, it's just like, oh, and they kind of look at you like you're crazy, or they just don't say anything, or they say something that's really the opposite of supportive. But you knew you could do it, and that's really the important thing. And clearly, it's popping off for you in this way. And once it started popping off for you, I'm sure they were like, and then they finally got it to a degree.
Eventually, yeah. I mean, for
Mm-hmm.
for a time it was because like I did a bunch of odd and end jobs, but while I was writing, because you got to supplement your dream, right? Like, so you have
Of
to, I
course.
worked at a rental car place, but when I started working at hip hop site and writing and worked in the actual physical store that was here in Vegas, and things started taking off. It became the editor in chief of like Hip Hop DX and started making a salary. And then took that side from was like 1,000 uniques a month to when I left, it was over 1,000,000 uniques a month with me at
Wow.
the helm. Then I went to what it wasn't until I got to BET that everybody was like, oh, I see that on TV. I know what that is. So that's when everything changed for like my family and my friends. Like people take you seriously. They'd be like, oh, cool, you make money doing this until they see you like on TV. And then they're just like, oh, wow, you actually made it. But I was laying the groundwork way before that. But it wasn't until I got to BT in 2008 that people were like, oh, wow, like you're successful. And I was like, okay, cool. Even though BT was like the worst
Mm-hmm.
job I ever had in my whole life. BT was like the worst job I ever had in my whole life.
Oh, wow. I was not
Yeah.
expecting that. Oh my gosh.
Awful.
That's funny because it's just I was gonna ask you, like, did anybody offer you like any type of advice once you got started? Like, and if there was any like words of wisdom that was shared with you, you know, what was
Man,
it, or how do you apply it to your life now?
man, I was flying by the seat of my pants, man. Like I was really like when I first started writing. Shout out to Mike Pizzo at Hip Hop Site, Matthew Conaway, who's now a publicist in hip hop. But they
Mm-hmm.
were both like the editors, and they used to just tell me like, just write as much as you can, right? Like take jobs that nobody else wants, but and then do it like there's no tomorrow. And that was it. That was it. And one of the things that I took much later, Jazz Fly, God rest her soul, she used to always say, "Do it scared." And that was like recently something that I applied. If you're not scared before you're doing it, maybe it's not worth doing. So if you're not nervous before you write that article or do that TV appearance or whatever it is that you're doing, it's too easy, right? So you got to challenge yourself. But that's always been my thing. It's like I've always been up for challenging myself. If things are too easy, I get too comfortable. I don't want to be complacent. I got to challenge myself. I got to move on. But that was like all the advice because it was just like from that point on, I was like, I just wrote nonstop. I just any assignment that came across my way, I'd take it, and see what would happen. But that was it in terms of advice because the people around me didn't know how to give me advice because they weren't doing what I was doing. So they were just like,
Yes.
okay, cool. Like, good luck. That was the advice that I got.
I definitely identify with that because when I said I was going to start a podcast, everyone around me, my mom, she sort of supports me and my sister regardless, but they were just like, okay. And there was really nothing they could say. They were just like, okay, well, you can try
Right.
that. And then some of the people in my life didn't even know what a podcast really was. So they was just
Right.
like, well, okay. And then I explained it to them like, okay, it's kind of like, a radio show, except it's not on the radio. That's kind of what it's like. And then that's when they really understood it. So I definitely understand doing something that you yourself have not any formal training in, but that that's what you want to still pursue. So I definitely get it. Like the flying by the seat of the pants thing, that's been my whole life for the past 3 years.
Hey,
My
man.
whole experience.
however you get there, that's my thing. It's like there's no clear path. Like there's no blueprint on how to be successful, and you can't follow somebody else's blueprint because usually that bridge is burned and you can't cross that same bridge. You got to find your own way, and whatever that way is that works for you, make sure it works.
Absolutely. And since you are right, noticed, like mentioned earlier off camera, like you've worked for so many amazing people, and then of course you brought up working for BET. Like that would of course be a big deal to anybody, especially to the people in your own community. But you did mention how you said that was the worst job you ever had. Like,
Worst up.
can you go into why a little, or
Yeah, I
or
can.
is it, yeah, okay.
No, I can. Anybody who's watching this, like, there is, if you Google my name in BET, there was a letter that I wrote when I exited BET that ended up in page 6 of the New York Post.
Oh
Yeah,
wow.
yeah. It was, so the skinny of it is when I worked at Hip Hop DX, I wasn't a fan of BET. I didn't like the music videos they showed. I didn't like the uncut. I didn't like a lot of things that they did. And I wrote a column called BET's Coon Picnic, and it was a riff on Nas's a song that Nas had wrote, and Nas actually read the article. And I was very critical of BET and how they could do better for Black people. It's the only network out there. We have to do better. Our programming has to be better. We have to spotlight positive people in the community, things of that nature. Somehow it turned into, I got a call from Kim Osorio one day, and she was like, "Hey, BET's trying to make a change in their music department, and I recommended you. Would you be interested?" And I was like, "Really? I just shitted all over this company. I don't know." And I thought about it, and I was like, "Well, how do you complain about things on the outside when you have the opportunity to change them on the inside if you decline that?" So I
Right.
took the interview and I got the job. Whew. BT is something else. I don't know. I can't speak to it now. I can only speak to my experience back then. But when I got there, it was 2008. So it's like the boom of the blog era was starting to happen, where music was not so radio based anymore. You had, Kendrick Lamar was about to be on the cusp, and J. Cole was about to be on the cusp, and Wale, Lupe Fiasco, things of that nature. But BT only played like, the top artists or whatever they did on their 106 and Park countdowns. And when I got there, I wanted to spotlight the internet, what was popping on the internet. And I think I've told the story on Twitter before. A young woman came to my office, but with Deb Antony, who was on Love and Hip Hop, and her name was Nicki Minaj. And Nicki she had her Beam Me Up Scotty mixtape, and she played some music for me. And I was like, "Yo, this is really good. What can we do to help boost you?" And she was doing a college tour. And she was like, "Hey, how about I do a blog for BET?" And I was like, "I think that's a good idea." And my boss at the time was not a fan. And she was like, "Get that big booty girl out of here. We're not going to spend all of any of our resources on Nicki Minaj." And Nicki edited the video herself, the blog herself, and sent it to me. But they didn't want anything to do with it because they thought the internet was nothing. Like, internet rappers, who cares? Like, they're not on the radio. So
Mm.
Nicki was like the first, and I was like, "Okay, this might not be the right place for me because I'm trying to put them on to people." Because the next one was Drake, and So Far Gone had dropped, and I was playing it in my
Wow.
office, and I said, "Hey, I have a meet with Drake's manager," and my boss told me, "Nah, nobody care about Drake. You need to worry about Gucci Man." And I was like, "Nah, I think this dude Drake's gonna be next." She wouldn't. She wouldn't let me take the meeting. It was like that everywhere. I brought them Kendrick Lamar. I ended up doing a documentary on Kendrick for Jay-Z's Life and Times much later. But I brought them Kendrick Lamar with J-Rock, and they was not hearing it. I mentioned Wale to them. I mentioned so many rappers, and they just were not interested until MTV did something. And then they were like, "Oh, can you call that rapper now?" No, not now. Don't wait for the white outlet to take care of them. We should take care of them first. So it was like that there the entire time. It was a place where it was a bunch of smart Negroes with degrees, but didn't know how to talk to people that look like us and it come from the places that we come from. I I had a meeting. There was a black NASCAR team was going to come to my office, and my boss said, "Oh, we only cater to this is too highbrow for our audience because we only cater to a demographic that is a three generation household with an average income of about 20 grand a year. So we need to keep it that way. And we can't do like all this smarty art stuff that you're trying to do. That was like my experience of BET. And when I only lasted a year there, and I wrote a letter upon my exit, and it was the worst job I ever had. There was a lot of yelling and shouting in the offices, emasculation of men. It was a disaster. But my experience in New York is how I met people like Kaz and how I met people like Emilio. And then like a lot of the people that I work with now in like the pro wrestling space, we all met in New York. So I can never take that experience of being in New York back. But God, BET was an awful, awful place to work.
That is so disappointing because out of all of them, with all the experiences that you mentioned and with the people who have now become a who's who, you know, in hip hop and also even culture wise, it's just there's so much that BET could have done to actually wrap around and bring in different audiences of Black people, because it's like you said earlier, like every Black person is not the same, because it's like even when I think of people like my boyfriend who actually grew up enjoying NASCAR, he probably would have appreciated, you know, a story like that involving an all Black NASCAR team. And I say all the time that I feel like BET, you know, should have came up with like an offset channel if they weren't going to put it on their main channel that highlights more stuff about HBCU sports, because for a time ESPN was not showing, you know, football games by the SWAC and the MEAC and stuff like that. Like by all means, the same way that ESPN and the SEC network highlights the Iron Bowl, BET should have been showing the Magic City Classic, because that happens here. So with Alabama State and Alabama A&M, that's what BET should have been doing, but somehow or another it wasn't. And I always felt that way, but never, of course, I was never in a space to say anything like that because, you know, I'm still an ordinary person. But at the same time, I said stuff like that all the time. And now I know that there was someone like you who was trying to make those changes and you were running into a brick wall. That is so disappointing.
Every day, like it was bumping heads with people, because it was frustrating, because you know when I worked at Hip Hop DX, the owner was a Canadian. He was Indian in Canada, so he didn't really understand the culture like that. He just knew how to make money, but he kind of let me do what I wanted to do. So when I got to BET, I was like, oh, this is cool. I'm gonna work with Black people that look like me. Like, this is gonna be amazing. I'm gonna present them these ideas, reinforce these positive stereotypes about African Americans and spotlight some great music. Nope. They were like, yo, we got to cater to this demographic, because this is the people that spend money. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of like the Parkers. And like, we showed that show like 1 billion times. And I was like, yo, there's other shows. Like, why don't we pick up like A Different World or something like that? Like, balance. I've never been the one who says, get rid of this because I don't like it. We should just balance it out with something else. Right. And I never felt like BET figured out a way to balance, like, you know, highbrow artsy stuff with whatever culture you're trying to represent at the time. I feel like you got enough space to balance it. I don't need my Sundays dedicated to church programming, right? Like, everybody who's Black is not a Christian. Right. There's other things you can present to them. And they were just like, nope, this is our bread and butter and we're sticking to it. All them ideas that you had, we don't want them. And yeah, it was awful. It was awful.
Yeah, and even now, you know, it seems like there's a level of sprinkling of some of your ideas that you had that they do now, but even then it's overtaken by a larger demographic of something else, and it's just of this one thing that they know is going to sell, or this one movie, or a series of movies made by one person that they keep showing every other weekend. That just keeps happening over and over again. I mean, no disrespect if you love that, you know, because there are people who do, but I'm just saying, like, there's still so much more that could have been done with that. But at least I know now that you were behind the scenes and you were, you know, trying to help with that. And clearly from your experience there, you know, you took the positive out of it and you connected with people like Emilio Sparks and like, you know, Kazim. And these are people who we are going to talk about a little bit later in our show, because there's still so much, you know, to discuss with our experience with that. So I loved the article that you did right on Kendrick Lamar and how you equated his To Pimp a Butterfly album, which is critically acclaimed, you know, everywhere at this point. And you equated it to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And then, of course, I love the article that you wrote about Bianca Belair last year when she topped the BRP 50 and for the first time, because of course she did it again this year. But I love the article that you wrote about it. And it's just your work. It's just really great and it's inspiring. So what inspires you to write things like that, where you're painting a picture of this person, you know, and sharing the things that you have in common with this person that you're writing about, while also giving praise to the work that they have done so far?
I mean, again, it's like the art of storytelling, man. And it's like for years, like I was raised by a television. So I was always in front of a TV and I was always watching like TV shows, and it inspired, like those things inspired me. Like a different world inspired me because I was like, oh, I want to go to college because of a different world. So and I read a lot, like I read a lot, like I have like 4 bookshelves in my house just full of books. And the art of storytelling is so imperative for us that I think to make it relatable for people to read, like found it I've always found my goal is to be able to, whoever's reading what I'm writing is to be able to relate to it. It's not, I love Michael Eric Dyson. I read his books all the time, but Dyson's books sometimes go over the average person's head with the verbiages that he uses, things of that nature. So I always want to find ways to bring the past with the present, draw parallels to things like with Kendrick Lamar and Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. It's just how Kendrick operated. And I read so much, I was like, well, how can I tell this story different than from what somebody else is doing? And that's always been my goal, because I don't want anybody to say, it's cool when people say, well, your work is like, but I want my work to be my own. And I want the things that I've done and presented and written and the shows that, like anything that I've produced, I want it to be different, because I don't want to be a poor man's anybody. I don't want to be a diet something else. I want to be Andreas Hale. So when I've told the story, like I love Bianca Belair. I think she's an incredible talent. But you got to have that emotional aspect, like her and Sasha being in that ring at WrestleMania and looking across at each other. And Sasha's like, I've been here before. I know what this feels like. And I see you getting ready to cry, but girl, you got to get it together, because we about to work the hell out of this match. That is like my favorite part of that match. And I wanted to tell that story in that article. Is like, she's next. There's nobody like Bianca. There has never been a wrestler like her. And I wanted to make sure people understood that. There's never been a rapper like Kendrick Lamar. And I want people to understand that. And however I have to do it, whatever parallels I got to draw, it's just reading as much as I've read over the years. It's just like, I want to be able to tell stories just a little bit different, but they're still relatable to most.
Yes, and the way that you told that story with Mercedes and Bianca at this point, you know, it felt really real, because I just know what it meant for me, because I was doing a watch along on that WrestleMania night with Women's Wrestling Talk, and I was on the verge of crying when Bianca started crying, because I'm just an emotional person that way. Like when I see somebody else crying, I start crying. And then I'm just like, oh my God, don't do this now. And I had to hold it in because I was on camera. But once the whole match was over and the whole match had happened and then the match ended and Bianca won, I just couldn't stop crying. I couldn't stop.
How could you not? I mean, but and I know there's so much wrestling talk, but that's the beauty of wrestling, right? Like to draw emotion out of people. And like what her and Sasha, obviously Mercedes, did on that particular night was so important to us, because 2 Black women main eventing a WrestleMania, right? And I had talked to Bianca before in the Sporting News right before the Royal Rumble, and she said, my dream is to wrestle another Black woman at WrestleMania. And it ended up being Sasha, and she won the Royal Rumble. They gave her that opportunity. Whereas 20 years ago, we would never have thought of a Black woman main eventing WrestleMania, no less 2 of them in the same match. So for them to be in that moment and noticing, again, Mercedes is like, I've done this before, but I've never done this opposite of somebody else that looks like me. And Bianca taking this all in, like on the verge of tears, not because she's scared, but she knows what this moment means to little Black girls all across the globe and just people, Black people. She knew what she was getting into that night, but it didn't hit her until that particular moment. And it's funny when you watch that match and Mercedes does that come on and like Bianca like nods her head and they just go. They go. And I was like, oh my God. Like I was overcome with emotion on that night. And then she wins, and Montez is sprinting
Yes.
down the aisle. I was like,
Yes.
that's Black excellence. That's Black love. Like, it's everything I've always wanted in my pro wrestling, because I didn't get that growing up. I didn't get to see that. People that look like me succeed. And as you get older, you start to realize there's people making decisions that they don't believe in that stuff. And that particular night, they believed in those two to have that moment and tell that story. And I felt it was only right. Like when BRP reached out to me, shout out to those guys. I love the Black Wrestling Podcast. When they reached out to me to write that story, I was like, I would be honored to, because you don't get to tell these stories on a variety of mediums. And telling that story and what it meant to me and what it meant to everybody else, because I know how emotional it made me feel. So I can only imagine somebody like yourself. It's like, I have to illuminate that story for others. And it was a fantastic opportunity.
Yes, I'm so glad you took it, because I love BRP too. They've been on my show. We did a crossover for Black History Month, and that was great. And it's just the idea of someone as excellent as her walking forward, into what she is. It's just such a beautiful thing. And her and Mercedes tore the house down. And I've watched that match so many times for clear skin. Like I've watched that match like so many times just to feel, good about myself. Like I've watched Kofi Mania for that too.
God.
Like I've watched like both. Oh my gosh. Okay. Like both of those matches are on my vision board for the year. Like because of what they meant for me and how it put the battery in my back to do what I do on a regular basis. Because watching these people that I love that look like me succeed in such a wonderful way is just fantastic. And with you mentioning, Bianca and Mercedes, like what was your take on everything that happened in the last year with Mercedes and Trinity and how they've risen above all of that to continue to prove that they are them girls? So
look, I love it.
Yeah.
So I never pledged allegiance to a promotion. I love talent, right? So people that started shitting on Mercedes for leaving and walking out, and Trinity for wanting to go to Impact, I was like, these girls are living out their dream, and they know that they don't need the WWE to do it. So the saga that's played out over the past year is just Mercedes did what she needed to do in WWE. Like, that is a girl who has always wanted to wrestle in Stardom. She has mentioned it numerous times. If you can find the interview, she says it a lot. Like, she loves Joshi wrestling. The fact that she's able to do that now, and she does like the Mandalorian and everything else, like that's what it's about. It ain't about a promotion. People are going to remember the WWE. That's great. But people are going to remember Mercedes for being Mercedes, not the WWE superstar Mercedes. And her and Trinity have had this opportunity to enjoy life, because I know wrestling is the grind, right? Like I'm sure it'll come up at some point. Like Biggie is one of my best friends, and we've been friends for years. I know how much a grind it is on people, and it's work. It's truly work. So if you get that opportunity to, one, if you don't like what's happening and you can just leave and start a new life, do it. So I think that's exactly what Mercedes did. She looked at this and she said, this ain't for me anymore. I've outgrown this situation. But my life isn't over. And so many people on social media were like, oh, it's over for her if she leaves WWE, because what is she going to do? She's doing just fine. I'm so happy for those two. Seeing Trinity and Impact is like, why didn't she go to AEW? Because she didn't want to go there. She wanted to go where she wanted to go. That Knockouts division and Impact is incredible. And she's the champ. And she gets to do her. I don't know why we're against people doing them sometimes, because we want what we think is better for them. That may not be what they want. Trinity and Mercedes have been on that grind for a long time. They deserve everything and more of what they asked for.
Absolutely. I definitely feel that way too. That was really hard, because the way it happened for me was just the fact that I didn't know what had happened, because I didn't watch Raw that night. I went to bed and I woke up and all heck was breaking loose. And I was just like, what is going on? And I had to run and do like media stuff for Women's Wrestling Talk involving it, because of course that is a platform created, by a Black woman in TK Trinidad, and is ran by a majority of us Black women. And they're going to ask us how we feel about these things, because of course these are involving two of the top Black females, in wrestling. And it was really overwhelming, but all I just kept hoping for was that they were just going to choose what was best for them at the end of the day. And clearly they did. They bet on themselves, and they knew that the music lived in them. Like Whitney Houston said in Cinderella, like the music's in you. Like when you know, and when you know it, and when you have found it, there's nothing that's going to stop you from doing what you need to do for yourself. And that's exactly what they did. And I love them for it. I'll always love them. And I definitely love them for it now, because clearly they are popping off in amazing ways. And I miss Mercedes so much, because she did get injured a few months
Yeah.
ago. But either way, even with her still making history with Willow, like, that's just, they're amazing, and I'm just happy that they're still succeeding. So the first time I, experienced your voice and your essence was, of course, when you were on Twitter. I noticed you on Twitter, and there was a whole lot of stuff that you would talk about with the New Day. And it's just, a part of me in my head was like, he has all this stuff to say about the New Day. Maybe I should follow him, because a lot of the stuff he has to say about wrestling is pretty spot on with a lot of things that I feel. So let me just follow him and just keep going with that. So how do you and the New Day connect and, keep your brotherhood alive even through so many life changes?
Oh man, so I met E through Kaz, and I can't remember how long ago it was. So I used to work right for MTV years and years ago, and MTV, I did a SummerSlam. I was covering SummerSlam for MTV, and I ended up interviewing the New Day, and I'm talking to Big E, and we were talking about music, and he mentioned he liked the Flatbush Zombies, which is like a very underground New York hip hop group, and I was like, oh really? Like I like them too. Few years passed, we didn't talk or whatever, and Kaz was like, you should be E. He loves like MMA and boxing. He's like, you guys have a lot in common. So he had texted me one day, and then I texted him back, and one thing led to another. We just started talking like every day, and it wouldn't be about like wrestling. It'd be about like Seinfeld or movies and TV shows. And then I met Woods, and I met Kofi, and we've always talked. We When we got the closest was during the pandemic. So after Kofi Mania happened, of course we stayed in touch. But the George Floyd situation happened, and the New Day had their podcast, and they wanted to do an episode on George Floyd. And Ian Woods and Kofi, they called me and was like, "Can you do this with us? Because we want this to feel very authentic." And I did it. It was a very emotional day for all of us, because dealing with that. But we all knew through them, and it's like I've always told them, like, I'm a fan first. Like, I love y'all as friends, but what you guys mean to this industry and people like me, who is like a nerd who likes comic books and video games, like there's a place for us in this industry. And you guys have carved that out. We don't have to be the angry black man in wrestling. Like, you guys have fun, colorful. So I've been with them, like we've talked all the time, and I did the Big E tribute at Wale Mania this year. That surprised him. He still hates me for it, but whatever. He's worse than me when it comes to taking compliments, but I love him to death. But yeah, it's just through life changes. Like we talk all the time. Like when I had my kids, and when Kofi had his most recent child, we send us each other pictures. I love those dudes, man. I like being friends with them is special because they're just like us. They're just people. They're just people, but they're in an industry that I love and respect, and the things that they do, dude. They had the folding chairs from the Birmingham, Alabama Riverboat Brawl. I texted them that night. I was like, yo, that's the blackest thing I've seen all day. Like, and I appreciate y'all for it, because it just puts some light on my day. I love those three. Those three are incredible. Me and E, yeah, we've been friends for years. That's like my brother.
Yeah, as someone who is from Birmingham, that was actually the Montgomery brawl, because Montgomery is an hour and a half away from us. But either way,
Thank you
it's
for
still
correcting me.
crazy. Yeah, it was
sucks.
still the most amazing thing that we had ever seen. Like, we're having a moment with
We're
that. And
having a
then with
moment.
Carmelo Hayes even made mention of it when he was doing his promo on NXT with Wes Lee. And I could not stop laughing, because I was just like, I love this. I just love this authenticity. I feel seen, like, from it.
Yes.
Like, oh my God, like the New Day does that for me. And they have done it for me for a long time, because weirdly enough, as a fan, there was a lot of people who did not like the whole gospel thing that they had going on at first. I loved it because I was, number one, I'm a church girl. Number two, too. I'm a choir girl. So I was just like, yeah, they're going to do something and it's going to feel like Kurt Franklin, because that's my thing. But a lot of people didn't like it. And I'm just like, why are y'all booing them? I like this.
Mm-hmm.
But then they flipped it and made it to what it is now. And it is so incredible. And then watching all the work Xavier has done with Up, Up, Down, Down, and making Black men who are into gaming feel seen. Like,
Yes.
I can't tell you how many times, you know, my boyfriend has lost his mind over something that Xavier or Big E has done when it comes to video games, or the unsportsmanlike behavior that Kofi has whenever he loses. Like, they be like, it's just
Yeah.
so funny. And I appreciate, you know, them being themselves, because it opens up people to be themselves as well. Like, who they are is so important. That's why I think they are the greatest faction of all time, because their impact, you know, goes a lot further than just in-ring stuff. Like, what they represent is a whole lot more loving and more authentic and deeper and stuff. So I live for them. And me and my boyfriend took it very seriously when Big E got injured, because that happened in Birmingham and we
Mm-hmm.
witnessed that happen. And that was the roughest thing. Like, we felt so sad, but he took it in stride, I guess, from on social media, as much as we saw. He took it in stride, and we were just happy that people were showing him so much love and so much appreciation. And I pray that at some point, you know, we'll see him again. But either way, I am so thrilled that you guys have that friendship and that brotherhood. And I could definitely tell, because I was at Wale Mania in the audience watching everything happen. And then when Big E came out and surprised everyone, because we didn't know he was going to be there. And as soon as I heard his voice, I ran out of the bathroom and ran straight to the stage. I was like, oh, snap, it's Big E, and just lost my mind. And with everybody showing him love and everything, it's just clear that he's surrounded by people who love him. And that's really the most important thing. And Kofi and Xavier, of course, are still carrying around that banner for the New Day. So I love that. And in speaking, you brought up that episode of the New Day pod where you guys were talking about the George Floyd tragedy. Like, that was one of the most vulnerable things that I had listened to at that time, because everybody was in their feelings. We were all upset. We were all angry. You know, there was just a lot going on. There was like a reckoning happening at that point. But you know, that was also the same year I had started my show As It Is, and I was trying to figure out how am I gonna mention this, but I had to, you know, have the courage to try and do it. And watching you guys talk about it and be vulnerable with each other about it as Black men, and being real with each other and leaning on each other's friendship so to get through that, was a very beautiful thing. And I appreciated you being a part of it as well, because you brought in your journalism and your activism into that and made it an authentic thing. So I definitely appreciated that at that time,
Yeah,
and still
thank you. And
appreciate it now.
I mean, dude, the pandemic was hard on all of us, right? But especially as African Americans in this country, to deal with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, like, to deal with those things was very difficult. But you know, the rose grows from the concrete, and you know, through that is how we came up with Our Heroes Rock, which is right behind me with what me and Big E came up with. It was, we just knew that we wanted to do something that made a difference in this world, right? Like, the short story is Jonathan Davenport, who does everybody's gear. He just did Ricochet's gear at SummerSlam, the Optimus Prime gear, which I pop for.
Yes.
I'm such a nerd. But you know, E was, after the George Floyd podcast, me and he had this really long conversation about, well, what do we do next? Because this conversation can't just live and die on a podcast. Like, how do we continue to make a difference? And we were like figuring these things out for like several weeks. And you remember they took a knee in the ring, him and Kofi.
Of course, yeah.
And one day he sends me some artwork for the gear that he's gonna have. And you know, it's Ruby Bridges and like Jane Elliott and Cornel West. Excuse me, it's cartoon characters. And I'm like, all right, who made that? And he's like, Johnny made it. I was like, okay, well, what are you doing with it? He's like, well, I'm just going to wrestle with it. I was like, and then what? He was like, I don't know. I was like, dude, that cannot just be ring gear. I was like, we have to do something else with that. I was like, if you want to make a change, because wrestling happens so fast, some people go, oh, that's cool ring gear, and it just disappears. I was like, we should make a cartoon. And, you know, me and Johnny got on the phone and we started a Kickstarter, and we was like, we want to make a pilot episode. I was like, hey, I got my connections in hip hop. I was like, I'll call my sister Rhapsody. And I was like, hey, Rap, I need a favor from you. If we get this thing greenlit and we make enough money, will you do the voice of Ruby Bridges? She was like, absolutely. Eric the Architect from Flatbush Zombies. Hey, man, will you do the beat? Absolutely. That's how this thing came to be, because we always felt like, and I know from my experience, like racism happens at a very young age for all of us. We experience it. We're all blindsided by us. Like all African Americans, I put a tweet out. I was like, when did you first experience racism? And most people think that these happen in your teenage years, but it happens at a very young age and very innocent when you're blindsided by somebody telling you, oh, my daughter can't play with you because you're black, or the N-word comes out or something like that. And we was like, we want to hit kids at a young age. And that's how Our Heroes Rock, which is Schoolhouse Rock meets hip hop, came to be. But that's Woods and that's Kofi and that's E. Like, this is how they think. How do we be progressive? How do we make an impact that's much further than anything we've done in the wrestling ring? I also want to tell you something. Wale Mania, to get E to come to Wale Mania was like pulling teeth. He didn't want to. Not that he didn't want to come to Wale Mania, but we knew we were doing this for him. Like I was planned out to do this whole thing to pay tribute to him. He doesn't like it. He doesn't like getting his flowers. He cringes at any time. So I couldn't tell him, obviously. But I was like, yo, you got to be here because we're going to present something with Our Heroes Rock. He was like, no, you can do that by yourself. I'm just going to go home and go to sleep. I was like, no, we got to figure it out. So I'm talking to Wale, and Wale's like, just blame it on me. Say we're doing something for Wale. So he's thinking the whole time, like, yo, that we're going to do something for Wale. So when he gets on stage, I'm like, nope. The look on his face, I thought he was going to kill me. Then we played the video, and he was like, I almost cried a few thug tears that night, but that was a special moment. It is like him showing up was like really hard to get him to do, because that man does not like to leave his house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's like, even on the 24 the WWE did on him, like he talked about, his introversion and how,
Yes.
doing things like that, is draining. And I understand that too, because I feel like I keep bringing up my boyfriend, Lord. He's an introvert as well. So it's just like, hearing him talk about that, hearing my boyfriend talk about it, and then hearing Big E talk about it, it's so interesting, because you would think somebody who's on television, wouldn't feel that way, because he's so, effervescent on television. He
Yes.
has all of that, joy and all the other stuff happening in the ring. And of course, he's dominant when he's wrestling. So to see that somebody like him with that big of a personality on screen can just, he's really reserved into himself, it's just like, oh wow, like it was really surprising. But he deserved that, he deserved that love and appreciation on a night where so many Black people were getting love and appreciation. And the Usos,
Oh yeah.
like they were getting their love and appreciation for everything they've done with the bloodline and Solo as well. You had Trinity there as a guest of honor. You had Jade Cargill there. You had everybody and their mama, who was anybody that was there. And that was my first Wale Mania ever. So, oh
Oh
my God.
really? Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
like
that was great.
that was an insane time to be to be alive to witness. Like, it's crazy, because I had been to WrestleMania before, except I went in when I was 17, and I went to the one in Atlanta. So that was the one I went to. So everything else that had happened, that would happen around WrestleMania weekend, either didn't exist yet, or I wasn't there for. And WrestleMania
Right.
was just one night then. So yeah, of course now it's a whole monster, and getting to experience it now, it's just like, wow, it's
Yeah,
just a wow thing.
it's a cultural experience now, right? Like with Wale
Mm-hmm.
Mania, like we did our little brunch thing, and it's just we want to make sure that, I think all of us in the space want to make sure that we're seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
For all the hard work that we do, because as we've seen, I think Black wrestling Twitter over the past like several years has exploded, and we kind of found our tribe. Like there was a time where being a wrestling fan, being an African American, wasn't cool. It's like, oh, you watch that wrestling stuff. But it's like when me and Kaz met, I was like, "You're a wrestling fan." He was like, "You're a wrestling fan." I was like, "We're best friends." Like that's kind of how this
Yes.
thing works. But now it's like there's so many people, like meeting Mega Ran, and like all these people in this community who love pro wrestling. We got to celebrate each other sometimes, because we don't really get a chance to. So like Wale Mania is that moment where it's not about what promotion you're with, it's not about who you write for, it's about just having a good time. So shout out to Wale and Kaz and Emilio and the team over there for doing that, because Yeah, it's special. It is special, and it's much needed. I wish you were there for the one for Kofi Mania, because that was an experience.
Yeah, that's what I heard, like from Jobber Tears, because they had went like with Sir Wilkins and Janelle and Mr. Black. They had went, and everything they were talking about that happened with that one was just lit. Plus, it was in New York, so it was closer to them. But that was
Mhm.
before I was in wrestling media at all, and I was just sort of content at that point with just sort of watching it and just being okay with that. Whereas now, since I'm in wrestling media, there's like this sort of push pressure to be there
Yeah,
and
definitely.
experience it. It's amazing. I can't get over it. So with all of your work in combat sports, how did you feel about the merger between the UFC and WWE?
Man, I don't know. Like, I don't know what it means exactly. Like, it's not like they're necessarily working together. I can't figure out exactly where the crossover is. I would assume that we start seeing some more crossover between the two companies, but it just feels like a huge business deal at this particular moment. Obviously, you've had so many wrestlers who came from the MMA world, like Matt Riddle, Ronda Rousey, Brock Lesnar. And I know for a fact that there's so many pro wrestlers who love MMA. So it would feel natural that there'd be a crossover at some point. I just don't know exactly what that's going to be. Um, the UFC is very rigid in terms of, like, when their fighters walk out, there's not like a wrestling walkout. It's a very, like, I'm walking to the octagon for my fight. I would like to see more wrestlers, more wrestling like walkouts, because I love the pageantry of a wrestling walkout. Like, I love the WWE 2K game. I'll spend all day just watching entrances. I just love watching entrances. So I like to see that happen. So I don't know what it means. I also thought it was strange. It's like Vince McMahon and Dana White being together. I was like, ugh, gross. But yeah. But I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know what the future holds for that. I just know they're making a lot of money together.
Yeah, and that's, I've had that question myself too. I was sort of wondering, like, what does it mean? Like, does that mean we'll see Conor McGregor, challenge Brock Lesnar at some point? Like, does that mean like Ronda will somehow, trickle back into UFC and then sort of like double up? Like, what does, like, I did wonder what that meant, but maybe we'll figure it out down the road, at some point. But I do know one thing though, with those entrances, I love that you brought that up, because I think of Big E again, doing entrances for people in boxing.
Yep.
So it's just like, if they do that so much in boxing, and stuff, you would think that in the UFC it would sort of make it an easy transition, but you just never know, I guess.
You don't know, and even with the boxing stuff, that was something me and E did together. It's like we walked out Sean Porter for his fight with Errol Spence, and we did Sean Porter for his fight with Terrence Crawford, and then E did the intro for the Wilder Fury fight. And those are things that me and him orchestrated without the WWE. It was just me and him. We were like, met Sean, and I was like, "Well, what are you doing for your walkout for the Spence fight?" And he was like, "Oh, I don't know." And I was like, "Oh, you should meet this guy at Big E." And I showed him like the intro to the New Day entrance, and he was like, "I want that." And we put it all together and made it work, and it went viral. And then for his fight against Terrence Crawford, we wanted to do the same thing. And I called Rhapsody, and I was like, "Hey, can you do this walkout?" And I was like people love that. I mean, Terrence Crawford was just walked out by Eminem, and everybody went nuts
Yes.
over it. So these are the things that I feel like could help the UFC in terms of identity, in terms of like viral moments. Fighting's cool, wrestling's cool, but I'm all about like entrances and what are you wearing, what's your ring gear look like. Like, I'm all about that. Hopefully those two worlds being together, we can see a little bit more of the fighters' personalities, because we don't see enough of their personality. We know they can fight, cool, but I want to give me something to sink my teeth into. Muhammad Ali is my favorite fighter, not just because of what he did in the ring, what he did out of the ring, and the way he talked trash. And he was an advocate for blackness. Like, I love all those aspects. Hopefully, the UFC will take a page out of that and bring more flair to their fights.
Absolutely. And even when I think of women's boxing, and how my favorite right now is Alicia Baumgartner, like I really feel like, forgive me if I'm messing up her last name,
No,
but
it's
it's
right.
just like, okay, yes, great. Okay. It's just when I see her, like I see like her either tag teaming with Bianca Belair or fighting against her, because they just have some of the most, they just have similarities to me. So it's just like, get into it just a little bit. Get into the wrestling thing. Like, it would just be fun, not just for me, but for other people as well. But I'm selfish. Like, I'm just like, you know what? Get into wrestling. Do this. But
Look, I just saw Alicia 2 weeks ago in Dallas. Alicia's a pro
Mhm.
wrestling fan. People don't know that.
Oh my
Yes.
God, that's so amazing to know. Okay.
And she knows who Bianca is, and Bianca knows who Alicia is. And I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Okay. I just really yelled. Okay, I'm sorry, but I'm just really excited to know that. Okay, that makes me so glad. Okay, so how do you feel about the state of wrestling now? What's great about it and what can be improved upon, in your opinion?
All right, what can be improved upon it is tribalism. I really hate wrestling Twitter. I hate it. I don't know why people pick sides. There ain't nobody paying your bills. Like, it's stupid. Just like what you like and don't yuck up what somebody else's yum is. Like, I like both promotions. I like Impact. I like New Japan. That's the beauty of pro wrestling right now, is that there's so many ways to watch pro wrestling. You're not just limited to WWE. Like, if you like amazing women's wrestling, watch Impact, because their knockouts division is incredible. If you like
Mm-hmm.
bell to bell action, like I just finished watching G1 and got all caught up, watch New Japan. Watch somebody like Will Ospreay. I think the beauty is that there's wrestling everywhere, and there's not a stereotypical wrestler that's successful. They all look different. They're all different colors. They're all different shapes. They're all performers at the end of the day. I just hate going online and listening to people or reading people's debates about why AEW sucks and why CM Punk is this or why WWE sucks. Just enjoy it. Just love wrestling. I'll never for the life of me understand the tribalism. And then people going back and forth about it and make it in like a real argument. I'm like, dude, nobody cares. Like, just watch it and enjoy it. Um, what else I love about the state of wrestling is the diversity. I mean, it should be pretty obvious. Like, it wasn't like this years ago, right? Like, seeing Ricochet open a match with Logan Paul, seeing Bobby, like being a black champion is not like, oh my God, it's a black champion anymore. It's like, all right, cool. We have a few of them now. Seeing the Street Profits, seeing Bobby, like the Hurt Business, like seeing so many different wrestlers, Carmelo Hayes, seeing Wesley. Wesley and Carmelo Hayes about to be the first two black wrestlers wrestling for the main title of NXT. I still hate that there's so many firsts. We should be past the fact that there are so many firsts when it comes to black wrestlers. But I do like we're acknowledging it, and it's happening because there is growth. But yeah, just leave the tribalism at home. And I'd like to see more of us working behind the scenes for these companies, whether it's in a producer role, commentary, booker. Like, we don't have to just be talent, and we're journalists, but we can do other things. So I'd like to see more diversity behind the scenes, but I think there's a step in the right direction across all platforms. All those companies are making great strides.
Absolutely. Like, I believe tribalism is the reason why this show exists.
Tell me
Because
more.
it was okay. It's just, I was on a Facebook group, and of course, we were full of wrestling fans. And around the time AEW was started, it was great. There was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of happiness about it. This is a new thing. It's great. But once the competition stuff started to happen, and once people were sort of trying to make it parallel to WCW versus WWE back in the day, that started to get really overwhelming for me. And I was just like, why can't we just love what we love and just leave it? And it started to get so bad that I actually had to like take a break from the group. And then I wound up just all around leaving the group. And at one point, they had talked about starting a podcast, all of us as administrators, but we never did it. And in my head, I was just like, well, if I don't have a way to really get out what I have to say about wrestling in a positive way online, then why don't I just start the show? And this is how it started. So, yeah, tribalism, it has its drawbacks, of course, but in that sense, it had its reward. So,
Well, yeah, through every darkness, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. But yeah, the tribalism thing is so strange because I just want to see people work, right? Like, I just want to see people get a steady paycheck because there was nowhere to go but WWE like a little over a decade ago. Now you have multiple promotions, and yes, the pay scales are different, but shout out to Cody Rhodes because what he created ended up being something that helped get people more work. And I'm sure he's still happy to see Ricky Starks main eventing on Collision. I'm sure he's happy to see the people that he came up with. People think that Cody went back to WWE means he's abandoned AEW, but I think he's happy with what he created there. But yeah, as fans, it's like, yeah, you could be critical of a storyline. Like, not all storylines hit. Some suck, right? Like, some storylines aren't great, but it doesn't mean the promotion's terrible, right? Like, I love the New Day. I also love AEW, and I love watching Powerhouse Hobbs, Ricky Starks, and Swerve Strickland. I think Swerve's doing some of his best work in AEW right now. But why can't I like them both? Why do I gotta pick? It's so stupid.
Yeah, like you can like it all and everything is okay. Like it doesn't mean that you like one over the other. It just means you just like just everything that you're seeing in wrestling. And honestly, like all of it can just be so exhausting at times, you know, but at the same time, as long as you know what you love, that's really all that matters.
Yep.
So of course, you know, you mentioned Powerhouse Hobbs and you mentioned, you know, Ricky Starks. You did have them on a panel that you did this year, you know, for African Americans in pro wrestling, talking about the past, the present, and the future. What did that mean to you to actually put that together, you know, at a Black sports journalism convention? Like, what did that mean to you?
Man, it was incredible. First, shout out to Gregory Gibson, the organizer for the Black Sports Business Symposium. He gave me a call. I did a panel called Wrestling with Stereotypes at Starcast several years ago. And when I did it, I didn't know how people were going to react to it. And then like Kevin Nash has shouted it out and Sean Waltman has shouted it out. So we did it. Moxley had staph infection. So we ended up being the main event at Starcast. And like Mick Foley showed up. Gregory Gibson was there and I didn't know who he was. And the panel went over so well, like obviously the pandemic happens, but he calls me and was like, hey, if I do this, would you host a panel? And I'm thinking in my head, I'm like, Rich Paul is at this conference, right? Like the Rich Paul and like all these Deion Sanders is a keynote speaker. And I was like, you want pro wrestling here? He's like, I love pro wrestling. Absolutely. So yeah, you reached out to AEW and they were more than happy to send some talent out there. We got Jade on the panel as well. Willow Nightingale. I can't say enough beautiful things about that. I love Willow. I love Jade too. I love them all.
Yes.
Stokely Hathaway was part of the panel. And I didn't know how it was going to be received. It was at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. It's in a stadium. And they put us on the main stage. And I was like, oh my God, like we're about to talk about pro wrestling in front of all these people. And I don't know if they like pro wrestling or not. So we had like a small crowd and it grew and it grew and it grew. And it was like, it was packed by the time we were done. Man, it meant the world to me because I got an opportunity to open the door for Jade to tell her story and Ricky to tell his story. Like the first question I asked Ricky Starks, there's no tape of this anywhere. I was like, are you Black? And the only reason why I asked this is because I know he is, but so many people question his Blackness. And he knew I was going to ask it. We had set it up beforehand because people were like, why is Ricky Starks on the panel? And I was like, because he's a Creole Black man. Like Black people look like this. And that's how we opened it up. And it was just like from that point on, the Black experience as pro wrestling fans, as pro wrestlers, what it's like Jade Cargill, like telling the story about being a mother to her daughter and wanting to be a good role model for her kid. It meant the world. And to get the reception that we got afterwards, I was shocked because I just didn't know what it was going to be like. So to be able to moderate and host that panel was incredible.
Yeah, because I remember when you first announced it, I was like, oh, that looks good. I wish I could go. But then I was just on my way back from LA to back to Birmingham. So I was like, yeah, no. But either way, like I support you in my heart of hearts, you know, get it cracking, guys. But yeah, like seeing panels like that are really important stories to tell. You know, it opens the doors for stories like that to be told to people who either know the stories or don't know the stories. So I was glad that you had that opportunity. It kind of reminds me of Katrina Blake and how her panel for women of color in wrestling got started. And she started at New York Comic-Con. And we were like at so many conventions at a time, and she's had different iterations of it, you know, throughout this year and even last year. So participating in stuff like that, you know, means the world to me. And it also still blows my mind that she even wants me on her panel, because it's just like, wait, what? You want me to do this? Like, huh? Because whenever I think of panels, I think, you know, they want like real, like big, important people, you know, but you know, it's okay. We grow. So
no, man. What you need is voices, man. And like the beautiful thing about panels is what I also realized is how thankful the talent was to be a part of the panel, because they don't get to tell their stories like that very often. They live as pro wrestlers, and oftentimes it's a facade of who they are versus who they truly are. And especially being Black in this business, you don't really get to open up about your experiences anywhere. And like for this particular panel was just like listening, like Jade's a sweetheart, and like nobody would know that. You look at her pictures, like, oh, she's so strong and all this. She is a sweetheart. Stokely's hilarious, right? Like there's no bones about it. The guy's just nuts. He's hilarious, but they all have stories to tell that they're not able to tell, and they need that platform. Every voice is important on a panel because it offers a different perspective. So even with you, it's not being big, it's you offer a different perspective, and that's what I think is appreciated more than anything else. Like, who cares how big of a following you have? What do you have to say? And you've got a lot to say.
Yeah, I do. And I appreciate you saying that though, because that really means a lot coming from you. I do have a lot to say. And in having so much to say about, the growth of wrestling and where it's at, there is so many improvements that need to be made, but at the same time, there's so much of great things that have happened, to involve Black people and other people of color as well. So I feel like as long as we continue to lay the groundwork and continue to speak out on the things that bother us and, hopefully just infiltrate those places so we can make those changes, then it'll continue to move forward as long as we keep working. So it's great. And one last question I want to ask you is, what do you feel that the future holds for you?
I don't know. That is such a good question because it's hard for me to think in the future. Like my wife gives me shit about this all the time. She's like, "Listen, we gotta plan. Like you fly by the seat of your pants a lot. Like you just do things." And obviously, one of the primary things is working on Our Heroes Rock, the pilot episode. Well, the short film is done, pretty much, and we're hoping to get into some film festivals this year to present this thing. So that's like my primary goal. But I don't know. Like, I'm on Sirius XM radio. I do Busted Open from time to time and some of the other combat shows. I don't know. I think ultimately all I really want to do is, sounds so cliche, push the culture forward. But in a way that is giving other people opportunities to succeed in these spaces. I need to see more of us in here. Like like I say on a podcast with the corner, I was like, I always need one Black person in a room when decisions are being made, that Black person could hear that idea and be like, no, that's not it. That's racist or that's offensive, whatever it is. I think having more of us in spaces that make decisions and make key decisions can only help us grow. And if there's anything I can do to help cultivate the next wave of those people, yeah, like I could have been, maybe I was a disruptor and maybe I still am, but I want like 30 disruptors and I want them all to be better than me. Some people, they get this idea that they can be the only one. I can be the only Black podcaster. Or I can only be the only Black wrestler in this space. No, because white people don't have it that way. There's a million of them. So there needs to be more of us. And we're all diverse. We all have different interests. We're all not the same. We're not a monolith. So if I can open the door for more Black commentators or more Black storytellers or more Black whatever, I want to see more Black women in positions of power. Like I really do. Like my wife is a strong Black woman. She's an attorney. I need more Black attorneys. Like anything I can do to help out those spaces. Yes, I worked in music. I worked in entertainment. Work in combat sports. I work in pro wrestling. I don't know what's next. Maybe it is film. But if the foundation can be to disrupt and change things and move it in the right direction, especially right now when you have people like Ron DeSantis trying to take African American education out of our kids' schools, especially when you have Trump trying to make a comeback, we're at war right now. And whether people want to realize it or not, like the pandemic was just the beginning. Like they waited their time and they're trying to strip Roe versus Wade and African like critical race theory, which isn't even a fucking term. It's not real. It's learning about the truth. What is wrong with that? If we can build that infrastructure, so when I'm long gone, we can keep fighting these fights because it's always a fight, whether you want to admit it or not. Until we own our own wrestling companies, until we own our own media spaces, I'm going to keep fighting for it. So maybe in the future, that's what I'm doing. Maybe I'm the Clarence Avon of pro wrestling. I don't know, but that's what I would like to do.
That's pretty amazing stuff. And I'm really glad that you did, mention the idea that there is so much going on in the regular world, even outside of wrestling, that has to do with rights being taken away and how what you're creating is helping to sort of speak to that. Because Our Heroes Rock is a cartoon that tells the truth, about Black history as a whole. It tells the truth about that. It fights against other like small little cartoons that you see on Twitter that tells anything but the truth.
Right.
And I am so happy that at the very least, you know, what something that you can say that you created is helping to fight that. And your voice is definitely needed in this space, and it's absolutely necessary. And you will be blessed in that. And I am so happy that you were able to come on the Hardy Wrestling Podcast and tell your story and talk about everything that you've done so far and everything that you hope to do. So yeah, I'm so happy this happened. So if you don't mind just telling everybody who's watching where they can find and follow you and what you've got going on.
Oh yes. Follow me on all social media platforms at Andreas Hale. My day job's is Sporting News, where I host a show called Fighting Words, and you can find all my written content on combat sports. I'm on Sirius XM, Unlocking the Cage, MMA Today, occasionally on Busted Open Radio on Sirius XM. You can find me there. Me and Kel Dansby, the Corner Podcast, wherever you get your favorite podcast. Kel Dansby's from ESPN Ringside, and we just talk about crazy shit: boxing, MMA, pro wrestling, hip hop, culture, things of that nature. I think that's it. Yeah. Our Hills Rock coming soon. Can't wait for you guys to see what me, E, and Johnny have done. We are very proud of this project. It's almost 3 years in the making now. With that, you'll be getting an announcement relatively soon. I think that's it. And Stephanie, thank you so much for reaching out. Like, it wasn't a question. I was just trying to find the time to make sure I could be on your show, because you've been doing some great work in this industry, and I, whatever I can do to help you, or whenever you want me back, I'll be more than happy to be back on your show.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy, you made the time to be on here, because I know you're busy, clearly. So there's no qualms about it. And of course, if you ever want to come back, you are welcome to come back. And I'm grateful to have an, ally like you in this. And I just can't wait to see what you and all of your amazing friends have to offer and show us. Like, I just can't wait. So of course, if you love this show, please subscribe on the YouTube channel, The Hardy Wrestling Podcast. And of course, follow it on Instagram and Twitter, X, like it says at the bottom of the screen, at Hardy Wrestle Pod, and on Instagram at Hardy Wrestling Podcast. And of course, if you want to catch me, you can also follow me on Instagram and X/Twitter at Queen Steph Hardy. And you can follow me and catch me on Women's Wrestling Talk, the #1 women's wrestling show on the planet, on Mondays on the WoW Superheroes After Show, and on the SmackDown After Show, which will be tonight, because we've got stuff going on there. So of course, this has been the Hardy Wrestling Podcast with your girl Stephanie Hardy and Andreas Hale. And until next time, bye y'all.